The Missing Necklace. One bright Saturday morning, Sophie decided to visit her grandmother, who lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of the city. Sophie loved her grandmother dearly and visited her whenever she could. This weekend she had planned to stay overnight and help her grandmother tidy up the house. As soon as Sophie arrived, her grandmother welcomed her with warm hugs and a plate of homemade cookies. The two spent the morning chatting and laughing as they cleaned the living room. While dusting an old wooden shelf, Sophie noticed a small, intricately carved jewelry box. "What's inside, Grandma?" Sophie asked. Her curiosity piqued. Her grandmother's eyes twinkled as she opened the box. Inside lay a beautiful gold necklace with a delicate emerald pendant. "This necklace has been in our family for generations," her grandmother explained. "It's very precious to me," Sophie admired the necklace, marveling at its beauty. After hearing the story behind it, she carefully placed it back in the box and returned to cleaning. The rest of the day went by peacefully, and after dinner Sophie retired to the guest room, feeling content. But in the middle of the night, a loud crashing sound jolted her awake. She hurried to the living room, where her grandmother was already standing, her face pale. "The necklace!" her grandmother exclaimed. "It's gone!" The jewelry box lay open on the floor, its contents missing. Sophie's heart raced. "Did someone break in?" she asked, scanning the room. The door was locked and the windows were intact. There was no sign of forced entry. The two women searched the house, but the necklace was nowhere to be found. The next morning, Sophie suggested they call the police, but her grandmother hesitated. "I don't want strangers in the house. Let's wait," she said. Determined to solve the mystery herself, Sophie decided to investigate. She checked every corner of the house and even questioned a few neighbors. Nobody had seen or heard anything unusual. Just as Sophie was about to give up, she remembered the family cat, Ginger. The mischievous tabby often played with small objects and hid them in odd places. Sophie searched the house, following Ginger's usual hiding spots. Finally, in the back of an old wardrobe, she found the necklace buried under a pile of socks. Relieved and amused, Sophie presented the necklace to her grandmother. "It wasn't a thief, Grandma. It was Ginger." Her grandmother laughed in disbelief. "That cat is always up to something." As they secured the necklace back in the jewelry box, Sophie felt a wave of relief wash over her. But just as she closed the box, she noticed a small note taped to the underside of the lid. It read, "If you're reading this, the real treasure lies in the secret drawer below." Sophie looked at her grandmother, who seemed just as surprised. Together they examined the box and discovered a hidden compartment. Inside lay a faded photograph and a letter from Sophie's great-grandmother, revealing a family secret that left them both speechless. The mystery of the missing necklace had unexpectedly unlocked a treasure far greater than gold. The Forgotten Suitcase. James was a young writer who often travelled to different cities for inspiration. His latest trip had brought him to a quaint coastal town known for its serene beaches and vibrant sunsets. The air was salty, the streets were quiet, and the town felt like a scene out of a novel. James was excited to spend a week there, working on his new book. After arriving at the small train station, James hailed a taxi and headed to the cozy inn he had booked. His suitcase was filled with everything he needed: clothes, notebooks, his laptop, and a few cherished items that reminded him of home. When he reached the inn, he checked in quickly and made his way to his room. As he opened the door, a wave of excitement washed over him. The room was perfect, with a small balcony overlooking the ocean. He could already picture himself sitting there, typing away on his laptop. But as he unpacked his things, James suddenly froze. The suitcase wasn't his. Instead of his clothes and notebooks, the suitcase contained expensive suits, jewelry, and a small leather notebook. Confused and slightly panicked, James checked the tag on the suitcase. It had his name, but this wasn't his bag. He tried to recall if he had seen someone else with a similar suitcase at the train station, but couldn't remember anyone. Nervously, he opened the leather notebook. Inside were strange symbols, sketches, and a map with a red X marked near the town's cliffs. James's curiosity outweighed his fear. Who did this suitcase belong to? And what was the significance of the map? The next morning, James decided to follow the map. He reached the cliffs where the view of the ocean was breathtaking, but his attention was on the red X. He scanned the area until he found a small wooden box buried under some rocks. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside the box was a USB drive and a note that read, "If you're reading this, you've been chosen. Follow the instructions on the drive and your life will change forever." James hurried back to the inn, plugged the drive into his laptop, and opened the files. To his astonishment, they contained detailed plans for a massive art heist scheduled to happen that night. The instructions were meticulous, with specific roles assigned to each member of a mysterious group. James was stunned. Was this real? And why was he chosen? Unsure of what to do, he decided to call the police. They arrived quickly, confiscating the suitcase and the USB drive. Later that evening, James sat on his balcony, reflecting on the bizarre day. He felt a sense of relief, knowing he had done the right thing. But just as he was about to go to bed, a knock at his door startled him. When he opened it, a man in a suit stood there, holding James's original suitcase. He smiled and said, "You've made a mistake, James, but don't worry, we'll make sure it's fixed." Before James could react, the man vanished into the night, leaving him questioning whether he had stepped into a story more thrilling than anything he could ever write. The locked room. Emma was an ambitious architect who had just landed her dream job at a prestigious firm. Her first assignment was to inspect an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of the city. The firm had big plans to convert the historic structure into a luxury hotel, and Emma was eager to make a great first impression. When she arrived at the mansion, its eerie grandeur took her breath away. The tall, ivy-covered walls and the creaky iron gates made it look like a setting straight out of a mystery novel. Equipped with her sketchpad and flashlight, Emma stepped inside. The air inside was damp and musty, with a faint echo accompanying each of her footsteps. The mansion was a labyrinth of grand halls, ornate staircases, and hidden nooks. While sketching the layout, Emma came across a locked door at the end of a narrow hallway. Unlike the rest of the mansion, this door seemed newer and sturdier, as if it had been added much later. Curiosity got the better of her. She searched for a key, but found nothing. Determined, she pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. As she turned to leave, her flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. For a moment she thought she saw a figure move behind her, but when she turned around, the hallway was empty. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She decided to return the next day with tools to open the locked door. The following morning, armed with a crowbar, she pried the door open. To her surprise, the room was filled with dusty furniture and old paintings. But one thing stood out: a large chest in the center of the room. Its intricate carvings and rusty lock made it look ancient. Emma hesitated, but eventually forced the chest open. Inside, she found a collection of handwritten letters and faded photographs. The letters revealed a tragic love story between the mansion's last owner, Eleanor, and a mysterious man named Victor. Their love was forbidden, and the letters hinted at plans for them to run away together. One letter, dated the night before, their escape read, "Meet me at the cliffside at midnight. If you don't come, I'll wait for you forever." Emma felt a chill. The story was romantic, yet haunting. She decided to investigate further and searched for records about the mansion's history. To her shock, she discovered that Eleanor was never seen again after that night. Intrigued and unsettled, Emma returned to the mansion one last time. As she stood in the locked room, staring at Eleanor's portrait, she suddenly heard a faint whisper. "He never came." Emma froze. The room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to close in. Dropping everything, she ran out of the mansion and never looked back. The next day, the firm decided to sell the property, deeming it unsuitable for renovation. But Emma couldn't forget the whispers and the letters. Somewhere deep down, she knew Eleanor was still waiting. The stranger on the train. Lily had always loved train rides. They gave her time to think, watch the world blur by, and dream about her future. That day, she was traveling to the city for a job interview, an opportunity she had been waiting for her entire life. Dressed in her best suit, she clutched her portfolio tightly, feeling both nervous and excited. The train was unusually empty, except for a few passengers scattered in different compartments. Lily chose a window seat and began reviewing her notes. She was so focused that she didn't notice when a man in a long coat and hat sat across from her. "First time traveling alone?" the man asked after a while, breaking the silence. Startled, Lily looked up. The man had piercing blue eyes and a faint smile that seemed kind yet mysterious. "No, not really," she replied, trying to sound confident. The man leaned back and observed her for a moment. "You seem nervous. Big day?" Lily hesitated, then nodded. "I have an important interview. It could change my life." "Life has a funny way of surprising us," the man said, his voice calm. "Sometimes the things we think are important turn out to be meaningless." Lily frowned. She wasn't sure if he was trying to encourage her or unsettle her. Before she could respond, the train jolted and the lights flickered. The announcement system crackled. "Attention passengers! Due to an unexpected delay, the train will stop at the next station temporarily." The train came to a halt in the middle of nowhere. Outside it was foggy, and the station looked abandoned. The few passengers murmured among themselves, frustrated by the delay. The man across from Lily stood up. "It seems fate wants us too," "Take a detour," he said cryptically. Then he walked toward the exit and disappeared into the fog. Curiosity got the better of her. Lily grabbed her coat and followed him. The cold air bit at her cheeks as she stepped onto the empty platform. She saw the man standing near an old bench, staring at something on the ground. As Lily approached, she noticed he was holding a photo. "What's that?" she asked. The man handed her the picture. It was a black-and-white photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like Lily. Her heart raced. "Who is this?" "She was my wife," the man said softly. "You remind me of her. She boarded this very train years ago on her way to a new life, but she never arrived." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened to her?" she whispered. The man looked at her with a sad smile. The train never reached its destination. Before Lily could respond, the train's whistle blew, snapping her back to reality. She turned toward the sound, and when she looked back, the man was gone. The platform was empty. Shaken, Lily rushed back to her seat. As the train started moving again, she clutched the photo tightly, unsure if what she had experienced was real or a strange dream. When the train finally reached the city, Lily stepped off, her life forever changed by the encounter with the stranger on the train, the vanishing roommate. Claire had been living in the bustling city for a year, working tirelessly as a graphic designer. To save money, she rented a small apartment and shared it with a quiet, bookish roommate named Sophie. Sophie had moved in 3 months ago and mostly kept to herself, spending her evenings reading or working on her laptop. One evening, Claire came home to find the apartment eerily quiet. Usually Sophie would be sitting on the couch, engrossed in a novel, but tonight her room was dark and there was no sign of her anywhere. Claire knocked on Sophie's door. When there was no answer, she pushed it open cautiously. The room was empty. Sophie's bed was neatly made, her books stacked on the shelf, and her laptop sat on the desk. But her backpack and coat were gone. Claire shrugged it off, assuming Sophie had gone out. Hours passed, and Sophie didn't return. Claire texted her but got no reply. By midnight she started to worry. Sophie was always home by then. Feeling uneasy, Claire decided to go to bed, hoping Sophie would be back in the morning. The next day, Sophie's room was still empty. Claire checked the kitchen and living room, but there were no signs of her. She decided to call Sophie's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in. Where could she have gone without a word? Claire called their landlord, Mr. Grayson, to report Sophie's disappearance, but his response was chilling. "Sophie? You mean the girl who lived there before you moved in?" "What?" Claire stammered. "She's been living here with me for months." There was a long pause on the other end. "Claire," Mr. Grayson said slowly, "Sophie moved out a year ago. She left after her roommate, someone named Claire, went missing." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. I'm Claire. I'm here." "Sophie was my roommate." Mr. Grayson's voice grew quieter. "Claire, are you sure?" Terrified, Claire hung up the phone and went to Sophie's room. She rifled through the shelves and drawers, desperate for some proof that Sophie had existed. She found an old photograph tucked into one of the books. It was a picture of Sophie, smiling brightly, with another woman standing beside her. The woman looked exactly like Claire. She stared at the photo, her hands trembling. Memories began to surface. Faint, disjointed fragments of laughter, arguments, and a terrible fall down the stairs. Suddenly Claire felt a cold breeze brush past her. She turned to see Sophie standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You finally remember, don't you?" Sophie said, her voice echoing in the silent apartment. "This was my home. You shouldn't have come back." Before Claire could respond, the room plunged into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, the apartment was empty again, except for the photograph, now lying on the floor, with Claire's face fading from the image. The silent forest. Ethan loved hiking. It was his way of escaping the stress of his corporate job. On a bright Saturday morning, he decided to explore a trail he'd never tried before, deep in the heart of a forest known as Blackwood Grove. The trail was rumored to be eerie and quiet, but Ethan dismissed it as local folklore. The first few hours of the hike were peaceful. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and the sunlight filtered through the tall trees. But as Ethan ventured deeper, an unsettling silence enveloped him. The cheerful bird songs faded, and even the crunch of his boots on the forest floor seemed muted. The air felt heavy, almost unnatural. Ethan shrugged off his unease and pressed on. Soon he stumbled upon a clearing with an ancient, moss-covered stone archway. It seemed out of place, as though it belonged to another time. Intrigued, he stepped through the arch. On the other side, the forest looked the same, but something was different. The silence was now deafening, and a strange fog began to roll in. Ethan checked his phone, only to find it had lost signal. He decided it was best to head back, but as he turned, the path he had come from was gone. Panic began to set in. He retraced his steps, or at least tried to, but every direction he took seemed to lead him back to the archway. The trees appeared taller, their branches twisting unnaturally. Ethan felt as though the forest was alive, watching his every move. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed a figure standing in the distance. It was a woman dressed in a long, flowing dress, her hair cascading over her shoulders. Relieved to see another person, Ethan called out, "Hello, can you help me?" The woman didn't respond, but beckoned him with her hand. Desperate, Ethan followed her through the thick fog. She moved gracefully, almost floating, always staying just out of reach. Eventually, they reached a small, dilapidated cabin. The woman stopped at the door, turning to face Ethan. Her expression was blank, her eyes distant. She pointed to the cabin's door and then vanished into the fog. Ethan hesitated, but felt he had no choice. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and cold, with a single table in the center. On the table lay an old journal, its pages yellowed with age. He picked it up and began reading. The journal belonged to a man who had also gotten lost in Blackwood Grove decades ago. The final entry read, "If you find this, do not follow the woman. She leads you to the cabin, but you'll never leave. I am trapped, and so will you be." Ethan's heart sank. As he turned to leave, the door slammed shut, and the fog seeped in through the cracks. The last thing he heard was the soft whisper of the woman's voice. "Welcome to the forest." And then silence. The lottery ticket. Nina was a waitress in a small diner, barely making enough to cover her bills. Her days were long and monotonous, and her dreams of traveling the world felt like distant fantasies. One evening, while closing up the diner, she found a crumpled lottery ticket left behind on one of the tables. The jackpot prize? $10 million. Nina hesitated, wondering if she should keep the ticket or hand it in. But after looking around and seeing no one who might have left it, she decided to check the numbers. "What are the odds?" she muttered, pulling out her phone to compare the ticket to the winning numbers announced earlier that day. Her heart nearly stopped. The numbers matched, every single one. For a moment, Nina stood frozen, staring at the ticket in disbelief. Could this really be happening? She imagined how her life could change. No more double shifts, no more worrying about rent, and maybe even a chance to see Paris, a city she had always dreamed of visiting. But her joy was short-lived. Guilt crept in. What if the ticket's owner came back looking for it? What if this wasn't meant to be hers? She wrestled with her conscience all night, unable to sleep. By morning she made up her mind. If no one came forward by the end of the day, she would claim the prize. The diner was unusually quiet that day, giving Nina plenty of time to overthink. As the hours passed, she kept glancing at the clock, waiting for closing time. Just as she was about to lock the door, an elderly man walked in. His clothes were worn, and his face was etched with worry. "Excuse me, miss," he said hesitantly. "I think I left something here yesterday. A piece of paper. A ticket." Nina's stomach dropped. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the ticket. "A ticket?" she asked, trying to sound casual. The man nodded. "Yes, a lottery ticket. I've been carrying it for weeks, but I'm afraid I lost it. It was my last hope." Nina felt her throat tighten. She pulled out the ticket and held it up. "Is this the one?" The man's eyes widened, and tears filled them. "Yes, that's it. Thank you so much." As she handed over the ticket, Nina felt a mix of relief and heartbreak. She watched as the man shuffled out, clutching the ticket like a lifeline. Weeks later, Nina saw the man on the news. He had won the jackpot and donated much of his fortune to charities helping the homeless, veterans, and struggling families. The reporter called him a hero, a man who turned his life around and gave back to the world. Nina turned off the TV with a small smile. She might not have kept the money, but she knew she had done the right thing, and somehow that felt like its own kind of reward. The midnight call. It was a stormy night, and Rachel was alone in her apartment. The rain battered against the windows and thunder echoed in the distance. She was curled up on her couch, a mug of tea in one hand and her favorite detective novel in the other. The story was gripping, full of twists and suspense, and she felt completely immersed. Suddenly her phone buzzed. Rachel glanced at the clock. It was midnight. The caller ID displayed a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end before a deep, trembling voice said, "Help me." Rachel froze. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice shaky. I don't have much time, the voice continued, ignoring her question. I'm trapped. They're coming for me. Who's coming? Where are you? Rachel demanded, her heart pounding. The line went dead. Rachel stared at her phone, unsure of what to do. She told herself it was probably a prank call. Still, she couldn't shake the unease the voice had left behind. She tried to return to her book, but the words blurred together. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the call. 15 minutes later, her phone buzzed again. It was the same number. Against her better judgment, she answered. Who are you? She asked, her voice firmer this time. Please, the voice begged. You're the only one who can help. Go to the old factory on Miller Street. Hurry, before it's too late. The call ended abruptly again. Rachel's rational mind screamed at her to ignore the call and go to bed, but curiosity and a strange sense of responsibility urged her to investigate. She grabbed her coat, slipped on her sneakers, and stepped out into the pouring rain. Miller Street was only a few blocks away. When Rachel reached the old factory, its towering silhouette loomed over her. The building was dark, its windows shattered, and the air around it felt heavy. Hello? Rachel called out, stepping cautiously inside. Her flashlight illuminated the empty space, revealing dusty floors and broken machinery. She moved deeper into the factory, her footsteps echoing. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered and went out. She fumbled with it, her breathing quickening. In the darkness, she heard the faint sound of footsteps. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Thank you for coming," he whispered, "but you shouldn't have." Before Rachel could respond, she heard another sound, a deep growl that sent chills down her spine. She turned to see glowing eyes in the darkness, dozens of them surrounding her and the man. The man grabbed her arm. "Run!" he shouted. Rachel sprinted toward the exit, the man right behind her. As they burst into the night, the factory doors slammed shut. When Rachel turned to thank him, he was gone, leaving her alone in the rain. The next day, she checked her phone. The number that had called her didn't exist. The forgotten camera. Alex was a freelance photographer known for capturing the beauty of everyday life. One day, he stumbled upon a flea market while exploring the city. Among the old books, antiques, and trinkets, an old Polaroid camera caught his eye. It was dusty and worn, but still functional. "How much for this?" Alex asked the vendor. $10, the man replied. "But be careful. People say it shows more than what's in front of the lens." Alex chuckled, brushing off the comment as a sales pitch. He handed over the money and left with the camera, eager to test it. That evening, Alex decided to take a few photos in his apartment. He snapped a picture of his desk, his bookshelf, and the view from his window. Each time, the Polaroid whirred softly, and the photos developed instantly. The camera worked perfectly, much to Alex's delight. But when he looked closely at the photos, something felt off. In the picture of his desk, there was a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, something that hadn't been there when he took the shot. In the photo of his bookshelf, a faint outline of a hand seemed to reach out from between the books. And in the photo of the window, there was a face reflected in the glass. A face Alex didn't recognize. Chills ran down his spine. "This has to be a flaw in the camera," he muttered to himself. To prove it, he decided to take one last photo, this time of his living room. When the photo developed, Alex stared at it in disbelief. In the center of the room stood a figure wearing a dark cloak, its face obscured. The figure seemed to be staring directly at him, even though Alex had been alone. Panicking, Alex grabbed the camera and threw it into a box. He shoved the box into the closet, determined to forget about it. But as he turned to leave the room, he froze. The figure from the photo was now standing in his living room, its cloak rippling as if moved by an unseen wind. "Who are you?" Alex demanded, his voice shaking. The figure remained silent. Slowly it raised a hand and pointed to the camera. Alex didn't know what else to do. Trembling, he retrieved the camera from the closet and held it out. The figure took the camera and disappeared in an instant, leaving Alex alone in the silent room. The next morning, Alex woke up feeling disoriented. The events of the previous night felt like a bad dream. But when he checked his desk, the Polaroid camera was gone. In its place was a single photograph of him, standing in his living room with the shadowy figure behind him. Alex never touched another camera again. The mysterious library. Emma loved books more than anything else. She spent hours at her local library, losing herself in stories of adventure, romance, and mystery. One day, as she browsed the shelves, she noticed a section she had never seen before. The books there were ancient, their covers faded and their titles embossed in gold. Above the section hung a small sign that read, "Restricted collection, staff only." Curiosity got the better of her. Looking around to ensure no one was watching, Emma slipped into the section. The air felt colder there, and the faint scent of old paper was stronger. Her fingers brushed against the spines of the books until one caught her eye. Its cover was blank, and it felt heavier than it looked. She opened the book and gasped. Instead of words, the pages were filled with moving images, like tiny films playing out in front of her eyes. The first image showed a young woman sitting at a desk writing in a journal. The woman looked just like Emma. "This must be a coincidence," Emma whispered, flipping to the next page. The second image showed the same woman, but now she was in the library, pulling a book off the shelf. Emma froze. The book in the image was the very one she was holding. Suddenly the lights in the library flickered. A soft breeze blew through the restricted section, even though there were no windows. Emma's hands trembled as she turned to the next page. This time, the image showed the woman standing in front of the library's main desk, speaking to the librarian. Panicked, Emma closed the book and returned it to the shelf. She hurried out of the restricted section, her heart racing. But as she passed the main desk, the librarian, an elderly man with kind eyes, called out to her. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Emma hesitated. I was just looking around," she stammered. The librarian smiled faintly. "The books in that section aren't meant for everyone. Be careful what you read." Emma nodded quickly and left the library. But curiosity gnawed at her. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about the book. What did the next image show? What was the purpose of those moving pictures? The next day, she returned to the library, determined to find out more. She headed straight to the restricted section, but the book was gone. Frantic, she searched the shelves, but it was nowhere to be found. "Looking for this?" The librarian's voice startled her. He held the book in his hands. Emma nodded. "Yes, what is this? Why does it show me?" The librarian's smile faded. "Because it doesn't just tell stories, it writes them, and now it's writing yours." Before Emma could respond, the book opened on its own, and the pages began to turn. The last thing Emma saw was her own reflection in its moving images, pulling her deeper into the story she would never escape. The empty apartment. Ryan had just moved to a new city for his job. The apartment he rented was small but affordable. It was in an old building, but Ryan didn't mind. It had charm, with its creaky wooden floors and large windows that let in plenty of sunlight. After unpacking, he noticed something strange. On the wall of the living room there was a faint outline of what looked like a painting that had been removed. The plaster around the outline was darker, suggesting it had been there for years. Curious, Ryan asked his landlord about it. "Oh, that's nothing," the landlord replied quickly. "Just an old painting the last tenant left behind. They took it when they moved out." Ryan nodded, not thinking much of it. That night, as he settled into bed, he heard faint sounds coming from the living room. It sounded like soft footsteps. He got up, turned on the lights and checked the room, but it was empty. He shrugged it off as his imagination and went back to bed. The next day, Ryan found himself staring at the wall where the painting had once hung. He couldn't explain why, but it felt like something was missing, like the room wasn't complete without it. That evening, he decided to rearrange the furniture to distract himself. As he moved the couch, something fell from between the cushions. It was an old photograph, faded and slightly torn. The picture showed a man and a woman standing in front of the very same wall. Behind them was the missing painting, a portrait of a woman in a red dress. Ryan felt a chill. How had this photo ended up in his couch? He turned it over and saw a date written on the back, March 15th, 1985. That night, the strange sounds returned. This time, they were louder. Ryan lay in bed, his heart racing, as he listened to the unmistakable sound of someone pacing back and forth in the living room. Gathering his courage, he grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. The room was empty, but something was different. On the wall where the painting had once hung, a faint image began to appear. It was the outline of the woman in the red dress. Terrified, Ryan called his landlord the next morning. "You need to tell me the truth about this apartment," he demanded. The landlord hesitated before finally confessing. "The painting belonged to a woman who lived there years ago. She was an artist, but one day she just disappeared. No one knows what happened to her, but people say her spirit is still tied to that painting." Ryan felt his blood run cold. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because no one stays long enough for it to matter," the landlord replied. That night, Ryan packed his bags. As he turned off the lights for the last time, he glanced at the wall. The outline of the woman was gone. In its place was a single sentence, written in faint red letters. "You found me. Don't leave me." Ryan never looked back. The locked drawer. Samantha was an intern at an old law firm. The office was located in a towering grey building that had been standing since the 1920s. Though the firm was modern, the building retained its vintage charm: creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and antique furniture. Samantha loved the history of the place, but one thing always caught her attention: a locked drawer in her desk. The drawer was small and made of solid oak, with a brass handle and an old-fashioned keyhole. Samantha had asked her supervisor about it on her first day, but he had shrugged and said, "It's been locked for years. No one knows where the key is." For weeks, Samantha tried to ignore the drawer, but her curiosity grew. What could be inside? Old case files, forgotten treasures. Finally, one Friday afternoon, when the office was empty, Samantha decided to investigate. She searched the supply room for anything that could help her pick the lock and found a small screwdriver. After a few minutes of careful work, the lock clicked open. Samantha's heart raced as she slid the drawer out. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed with age, and a small black-and-white photograph. The photo showed a group of people standing in front of the office building, smiling and holding a sign that read, "Grand Opening, 1923. Samantha turned the photo over and saw a list of names written neatly in ink. One name was circled, Margaret Collins. Curious, she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated October the 3rd, 1923. The handwriting was elegant but shaky. The letter read, "To whom it may concern, I write this as a warning. Do not trust Margaret Collins. She is not who she claims to be. The decisions made today will have consequences that last a lifetime." There was no signature, just the initials. R.L. Samantha's hands trembled. Who was Margaret Collins? What had she done? She felt a chill run down her spine and quickly returned the letter and photo to the drawer. She locked it and decided not to mention her discovery to anyone. Over the weekend, Samantha couldn't stop thinking about the letter. On Monday, she did some digging and found an old record of the firm's founders. Margaret Collins was listed as one of them, but there was no other information about her. It was as if she had disappeared after 1923. That evening, as Samantha was finishing her work, she felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching her. She looked around the empty office, but no one was there. Then she noticed the locked drawer was slightly ajar. She approached it cautiously and saw a new piece of paper inside. Her breath caught as she read the words scrawled in red ink. "Why did you open it?" Samantha slammed the drawer shut and grabbed her things, vowing never to stay late at the office again. But as she turned off her computer, the screen flickered, and for a brief second she saw a woman's face staring back at her.